Okay, Martin Luther King speech, King Jr. speech. Remember that I'm going to leave the background information up to you. You can figure out, when the speech was given, what the audience was, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to mostly stick to um, identifying ethos, pathos, logos, syntax, diction, rhetorical devices, that kind of stuff, and be sure to fill in that information in the chart as it comes up. It's just going to be easier that way than going back and filling it in afterward, I think. But it's up to you, of course. Okay, so I don't think this had the title until much later, but okay. So he says, "I'm happy to join with you today in what, and I'm for the record, I'm not trying to. There's a video of him giving the speech. I'm not trying to uh, sound like he did, right? I'm just reading it. Okay. And if I get excited about it and start reading it a certain way, that's me, not him. Okay. I'm happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Okay. Right away, starting off with ethos. This is like what you're witnessing right now, not just this speech, right? But this whole event that we're at, this march and all the speeches you're listening to, you are witnessing, you are part of one of the greatest, demonstrations for freedom in the history of our nation. So right away, people are feeling good about this, right? They're feeling good about being here. They're like, oh, I got to listen to what you're going to say because this is an important event, and turns out it was. Right? Okay, so then he says, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln. Okay, and this 50 years ago, that's a homage, I suppose. A reference um, to 7 years ago. Okay, so when speechwriters do this and speakers do this, it's a little bit of, I would call it a little bit of ethos because it's making a connection to another really important speech. So it's almost as if it's saying, well, this speech is just as important. So it's not even saying that, it's not being arrogant about it, but it's just making this connection. So the connection of this speech to an important speech makes this speech sound more important. Okay, so I would definitely call that ethos. This five scores, and then Emancipation Proclamation, connection there. It's all ethos. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. Okay, this is all imagery. Okay, this great beacon light of hope. I mean, it's personifying it, right? It's saying that this speech that was given, this Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, 100 years ago, uh, it was like the slaves had been traveling in the night and seared by injustice. There's flames all around them. And all of a sudden, it's this beacon light, it's this lighthouse kind of light that shines over them and like frees them. Okay, so you get this image, you could picture that image in your head. But he starts out by saying this is such a great thing. However, 100 years later, the Negro is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. So we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. Okay, there's a lot going on in this paragraph. So first of all, you have a lot of repetition. Okay, and we need to talk about the difference between repetition and parallel structure. Repetition is when the words are literally exactly the same, and it doesn't have to be It's not the same sentence over again. A lot of times it's just the first part of a sentence, or a certain part of a sentence. So 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later. Why do that? Really wants to emphasize that point. And this is going to come back a little bit later too. So just it has been so long. And when you hear that, like, it really sinks in how long it's been, like 100 years, right? That the slaves have been free, and yet still. Okay. Then we've got, this is not parallel structure though, because the structure of the sentence is not the same every time. Okay. So then we have some imagery here. Life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Manacles and chains. Okay. But it's a metaphor. It's not literal chains, it's the chains of discrimination. But if you're discriminated against, it's as if you're in chains. If you're segregated, which they were during the time of the speech, the black people were, then it's like you're being manacled. Okay. But this image of manacles and chains is certainly going to bring up a lot of um, pathos. Now, let me be clear. The entire thing is going to be pathos. When I say pathos, I'm just bringing up particular, like, much more emotional stuff. You if you talk to, especially, people that were around closer to the time of slavery, um, when you bring up slavery and images of slavery, that's going to be a very emotional thing, very difficult to listen to. Um, And then this is all imagery here too. The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Like you can imagine that this ocean of prosperity. Like there's so much wealth. There's just money, ocean of money, and you're on this island where you can't access it. Right, languishing in the corners of American society, an exile in his own land. Um, they are pushed to the corner, right? He's saying we are pushed to the corner. I'm not obviously putting myself in that group. And so, this is all imagery, right? And he's just describing the current condition, of black people at the time. Um, and that's, it's like we had this great thing that where we are freed, but 100 years later, we haven't actually gotten that freedom. In a sense, we have come to our capital's nation to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was full heir, meaning I should get my inheritance that you promised. Declaration of Independence. Now, this is kind of name dropping, but again, well, I guess I wouldn't call this ethos because he's not drawing a connection to it. What he's doing is he's saying, look, this is building up a little bit of pathos here, because when anybody talks about like the flag or America or freedom and all this stuff, there's a sense of like pride, right? And if he says, look, the Constitution, like this is the thing that Americans are most proud of, right? Declaration of Independence, like this gave us our freedom, right? And yet that was a promise. This note was a promise to all men, yes, black men as well as white men, that would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so here, this is just quoting. Okay, so I think you could call that ethos, because you're quoting something that's very important. Um, so it's like using evidence. So you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's true. But that's the thing, like this document that you give so much weight to, that you think is so great, was a promise, and it let us down, right? It didn't give us, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. That's some imagery, because we could all imagine somebody cashing a check. But it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. And it's like, wait a second, America has defaulted. That's um, that's pointing a finger at America, right? And saying, this country that's built on democracy has failed a group of people, right? Um, so this is laying on the pathos. It's guilt, right? Like this is the thing you're so proud of, and yet it has let us down. And defaulted, if you go into default, then your credit rating is ruined. Like nobody trusts you. Okay. So this is like America has defaulted, and nobody can trust America for the promises that America has made. It's like, what, and so, uh, as insofar as her citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. That's another, like, this imagery. And again, it's this guilt. So this pathos is coming through to people. It's kind of aimed towards people who are not black, the governors and the people that are in charge of America. And it's saying, you know, you promised us this and you've written a bad check. Like that's the worst thing you can do. You're a crook, essentially, right? Um, you've written a check and it's bounced. Because that's what a check is. A check is a promissory note. It promises that, when you cash it, that money will come to you. And the check has come back marked insufficient funds. Like that's embarrassing, right? When your checks bounce. So that's again this pathos that he's trying to push on people that are in charge. He's like, you're letting us down. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. Okay, Bank of Justice. Again, this isn't a literal bank. Okay, this is imagery. This is a metaphor. But we can picture someone walking into a Bank of Justice. That's why it works as imagery. And imagine that, instead of getting money, you get justice, right? We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. Again, you can imagine, this is imagery. Imagine the vaults of opportunity. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. Okay, so again, we've come to cash this check. It's imagery. We can imagine someone, okay, I'm here to cash this check. But it's not giving us money, it's giving us freedom. Like, here's my check, give me my freedom, right? And security of justice. We've also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children. So, again, we have more repetition. And so it's interesting if you start to look at the pattern of which phrases are repeated. 100 years later, now is the time. Do you see a pattern here? It all has to do with time. We've waited this long. We don't want to wait any longer, right? So it starts with 100 years has passed. In the past, all this time of segregation and oppression and all this. But we're here now, so let's do something now, right? And certainly more imagery, right? Now is the time to rise from the dark, desolate valley of segregation. Again, that's an image, it's just metaphor. Okay, it's not literally, we're not literally going to a place called the valley of segregation, right? And we want to move to the sunlit path of racial justice imagery. I can picture this dark valley, but then this light shining down, and that's where we want to go, right? Quicksands of racial injustice, solid rock of brotherhood. It's all imagery. It's all imagery. And then repetition. Anytime that you mention God's children, that's probably going to count as ethos because you're getting like the Christian group is going to, and this is generalizing a little bit, not all Christians are like, oh, you say God, so I'm on board. But, if you show that, um, well, first of all, Martin Luther King was a pastor, okay. But if you introduce, a religious kind of connotation to the whole thing, to show that, um, this is a religious cause, then people that are religious are more likely, you're going to build ethos with a certain group. Okay, let's just say that. So it continues. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. Okay, more imagery. Again, it's not literally autumn, but autumn, it's like the leaves are falling. We're clearing out the dead stuff, right? The dead leaves and all this. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. Let's continue. I was almost going to say something there. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt, more imagery, will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. A little bit of imagery, not quite as strong there, but this whole thing is really good, right? I hope you can appreciate just the language, and everything sounds so important, right? These giant images of the bank of justice and the halls and the vaults of whatever, inequality or equality or all this stuff. This is a speech that is meant to be said in front of a large crowd. You can tell, like it's just written that way, where you have, it's like a graduation commencement speech, right? It just sounds, you have all these lofty, imagery and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't make it bad or cheesy in any way, but that's the diction, okay? The diction, the word usage, everything, and also the syntax, everything, the sentence structure is put together in a way where it just sounds important, right? Especially with the repetition does that, this would be very different in other speeches, that we read, even on the same topic. But there is something I must say to people who stand on the warm threshold that leads into the palace of justice. More imagery. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. I'm going to keep going because this is all connected. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must now not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights for meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many, our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. Now, this is very close to parallel structure. Have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. Okay, this is a good example of parallel structure because the words, even though there's some repetition here, have come to realize that but here we have their destiny, their freedom. These are both the same kinds of words. Like it's a noun, okay? Is tied up with our destiny, is bound to our freedom. Slight differences, but very, very close, and tied up and bound, they're both verbs, right? Bound to, tied up with, like, and we have the preposition. So it's parallel structures when the word types are the same. We have I've come to realize that pronoun, noun, helping verb, verb, adjective, no, sorry, adverb, preposition, pronoun, uh, noun. If you mapped out this one, it'd be about the same. There might be one small difference, but that's where. Now, I also want to point out that here, this he's kind of changing audience. The audience is the same, but his target, who he's specifically speaking to, has changed. So, he's kind of addressing the white people, right? And he's basically kind of saying, hey, as evidenced by look at the white people here, they are realizing that this is really important, right? And so it's almost kind of an indirect thank you for being here, not quite. Uh, but up here, when it says those who hope that the Negro would blow off steam and will be content, we just needed to blow off some steam and now we're just going to go home. They're going to have a rude awakening. That sounds like he's specifically talking to, like lawmakers, people in the government. And then here, it sounds like he says, I must speak specifically to basically black people. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst of freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. That again, of course, is imagery. But what does he mean by that? Don't degenerate into physical violence. He's basically telling black people, look, don't give white people a reason, an excuse to not give us our rights, right? If all of a sudden we start doing, all this violence, they're going to say, see, give them freedom. Here's what happens, right? Um, and he specifically addresses a even more specific group. The marvelous new militancy, which has engulfed the Negro community, must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. Um, he's talking about someone very specific there, whose name ends with an X. First name Malcolm. Okay, so Malcolm X. We're going to read one of his speeches. There's essentially two kind of groups. I'm sure there were more, but there were two kind of ways of thinking about how to get how blacks should get their freedom or their rights. One was like peaceful protest kind of stuff, and that's Martin Luther King. And then the other one was like get some guns and forcibly take your rights, right, where you should have them. And that was Malcolm X. So I would call this ad hominem. Remember, we went over this in the article, Three Ways to Persuade. I would argue that he's not quite attacking Malcolm X, but he's saying, look, don't ruin this for everyone. Okay, so it kind of is. So I'd say this is a little bit of a kind of a gentle nudge, but certainly directed towards Malcolm X, I think. Okay, let's continue. As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? Like, when are you going to be satisfied? Like, just, is that enough? When will it be enough is basically what that means. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from the smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote. That's voter suppression. That was happening at the time. And a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. More imagery there. This is interesting. He changes up his, this would be like repetition, except he changes what he says quite a lot. We are not satisfied, we're not satisfied, we're not satisfied. But we can never be satisfied. we can never be satisfied, but then we cannot be satisfied. We can never be satisfied. So mostly the same, but there's a little bit, we cannot be satisfied. Um, which again is kind of a time thing. Like, when is this going to be over? No, no, we're not satisfied. Like, it's not time yet. 100 years, now is the time. It's not over yet, kind of thing. So yeah, okay, you could call that. You could certainly call that repetition. Um, and you could argue that this is kind of a little bit of logos. It doesn't get into depth, the argument, but certainly it presents an argument that we should never be satisfied and think that we have our freedoms when these things are happening. He has a list of things that still happen that were happening at the time. Police brutality, can't get a room at a hotel even though there's vacancies, that kind of thing. That happened quite a bit. Um, Having a hard time moving up the socioeconomic ladder. Um, and so I think this could count as logos because he's saying these are the reasons why we should not be satisfied. Okay. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. More imagery. You have been veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and the ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. Now, this is pretty interesting. First of all, parallel structure, okay, because we have the words go back to, but then the last word changes, but it's always the same type of word. It's always a place. I mean, specifically state, right? But this is interesting because it's like, this is almost the command that he's making. What should we do now? We'll go back home. Well, wait a second. What did we come here for? What was the purpose of that then? But what he's saying is, well, he's saying a few things. Martin Luther King Jr. had meetings with like the president, right? He was working kind of with lawmakers to try to get things changed. Okay. Um, and so, and he just said earlier that you can't be violent. Now he's saying, look, the best thing you could do is go back and just let me handle it. Essentially, he doesn't say that, but that's kind of the message here. Is I know you just came from jail cell. I know you're going through all these things. All you can do right now is just go back. It's coming. We're getting our freedom, but you have to wait. I'm working on it. Okay, but you can't cause any problems in the meantime. I say to you, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Now, this part's kind of cool. If you watch the video, and you should maybe skim through some of it, but there's a video. If you look at Martin Luther King speech, like the Canvas page, I have the YouTube video up there. Skip to the last part. It's not super dramatic, but you'll see. He's kind of given this speech, and it has a certain tone to it, and da 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 da, and then all of a sudden he goes into this "I have a dream" part, and he gets a little more animated, like just a little bit. It's not super dramatic, but you can kind of see and then there's a certain part where he kind of goes back to the rhythm. Okay. This part is improvised. That's what's so incredible. This is the part that everybody knows about, right? I have a dream that one day, and some of it I think was in his original speech, but someone in the crowd behind him, you can hear this woman say, yeah, yeah. But someone in the crowd behind him says, tell us about your dream, Dr. King. And he's a pastor, right? He's used to like just off the cuff, like just coming up with all kinds of, this is the kind of thing he does for a living. Um, and so he just like goes into it and it's so impressive. Like he came up with some of this stuff just on the spur of the moment. And you could see it in the speech. When he's given the speech, you could see his mind turning. He's like trying to get just the right words. He's like, just a little bit. So that part's really impressive. But okay, let's get into it. Okay, this is like the exciting part. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Ethos, okay? Because he's quoted. This is like your evidence. He's quoting, and when people hear those words, Constitution or the Declaration or whatever, it's like, oh, this means something, right? And if this document that's so important is not actually being lived out, then what does it say about our country? Um, so I think that's ethos. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Table of brotherhood, more imagery. Okay. Uh, but this image of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will sit down together. That's quite an image, right? I have a dream that one day, even in the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering in the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed, into an oasis of freedom and justice. More imagery. You just come up with this stuff. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's one of the most famous lines from the speech. Um, I have a dream today. Now, repetition, right? Same thing. I have a dream that one day something, something, something. And it's not quite parallel structure because it's all quite different. Um, I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor, this is ad hominem, no question, and he's pointing this guy out specifically, having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, like he just came up with this on the top of his head. These giant words, and his diction, like this is formal language. Okay, one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. I think that, again, mentioning religious stuff is going to bring out a little bit of ethos. People that are religious is going to really, connect with that part. Um, and there's certainly some imagery here. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the south with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out a mountain of despair, a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. More imagery. With this faith, and of course, this is repetition because he's saying the same thing over and over again, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. Now he's quoting, of course, famous song. I think that could count as ethos. Like anytime you're going to throw in a quote, you're going to bring in a reference to something that people love. I think you're building your ethos, okay? And if America is to be a great nation, this must come true. So let freedom ring. Now that's part of the song, right? Let freedom ring, right? And so now he takes part of that song and he's going to use it in his speech. So you could call that ethos as well. Let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Um, Parallel structure, because here, let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of North New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. So again, the structure of the sentence is the same. You have the first part, but then it goes into from the adjective, noun, uh, preposition, state. Adjective, noun, preposition, state. Parallel structure. Okay, it makes it sound like important. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of the Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. It's all parallel structure. But not only that, let freedom ring from the stone mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from the lookout mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountain side. Let freedom ring. When we let freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So he ends, I would argue, that this is, again, uh, he's quoting directly the old Negro spiritual. And so people are going to resonate with that. So that's going to be his ethos as well. So what's the bottom line here? We have tons of imagery, like just an enormous, it's probably the most imagery. In fact, no question, it's the most imagery of any speech we're going to read this year of the 5 speeches. Um, and the language and the diction is and the syntax, it's all so important, right? It's not that it's super long lines, but it just everything sounds like he's giving a sermon or he's making this big speech to a lot of people. um, and everything sounds so important. Instead of just saying we want our freedom, he's saying we're going to the bank of justice to cash a check. Like, it just sounds so much more important, right? um, and a little bit of ad hominem here and there, and certainly the parallel structure, again, making it sound so important. um, and a little bit of logos. The whole thing I would call pathos, but there, any time specifically is talking about like slavery, that kind of thing, it's going to bring up certainly more, or racism, or any of that stuff. It's going to bring up more pathos. Um, Let me know if you have any questions. Um, and I think that's it. Thanks for listening.